Hello and welcome to Priority Zero, a lead dev engineering leadership podcast. I'm your host, Scott Carey, and today I'm joined by Anil Dash. I'm going to take a deep breath before I do this part because Anil is a developer, blogger, podcaster, entrepreneur, one-time advisor to the Obama administration, and now head of Glitch and VP of developer experience at Fastly, which is through an acquisition we will probably talk about. And he is also a scholar of the musician Prince. He lives here in New York City. Anil, thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks so much for having me.
Before we get started, tell me about how you became a scholar of Prince.
I mean, some of this is just a function of age. I feel like any of us who were alive in the 80s, you just couldn't avoid. I mean, I think it was, Michael Jackson, Madonna, Prince, like all these folks. And to me, actually, probably for your audience in particular, I love the music and I love the performance and all that kind of stuff. And this was sort of a great, pop artist. He was a real geek. Yeah. He really loved the internet. He was really cutting edge at how he used technologies, stuff that, we take for granted of like, Taylor Swift has Taylor's version now. Like a lot of that stuff around intellectual property and ownership and distribution, he was experimenting with as much as he was experimenting with the music. And so it was sort of like the two halves of the brain come together. So I couldn't not be enchanted. And then the other part I think probably pertinent to this, is like a lot of folks, like I found a fandom community and you find the other people. And in that case, they were later, I would find out this person I knew because we would go to a show was like, a senior exec at Google or, a policymaker at the White House or like, they have their other life, but they found this thing that was either resonant because of the art or that was intellectually interesting or just fun because you're in community. So yeah, that's definitely the hook.
I've never thought of Prince as like the geeks pop star, but I can see the connection there.
Yeah, music nerds for sure are like, even if they're like not a fan of the music, they're like, I get what he was doing. That's really interesting. So that's cool. Yeah.
Me and producer Justin were just talking about movies in the 80s and obviously Purple Rain being an absolute stone cold classic. So.
Yeah.
All right, we're here to talk about engineering, not Prince, unfortunately.
Absolutely.
But Anil, you've been doing this for quite a while, but I want to go all the way back. Like, when did you get that first inkling that software was something you'd be interested in?
It's funny. It's another 80s story. I was lucky enough. My folks are immigrants to the States and, had gotten onto solid enough ground by the time
Where
from? From India. So then from the eastern region of India, India's sort of a diamond shape. We're the eastern point of that estate called Odisha. And, family's all still there, but they had come, my dad had come actually quite early, 1963. And so they had just gotten sort of on solid ground enough to be able to like, sister, like take care of the two of us and then say like, let's get them ready for life. So let's get them a computer. And so I was, I couldn't have been more than 5 or 6 years old. And we got a Commodore computer. Yes. Classic. And actually, people talk about the Commodore 64, which I think is still the best-selling individual computer model of all time. We actually had its predecessor, a VIC-20. And the thing I try to explain to my kid or like people I mentor is the entire memory on that machine was 5K.
Yeah.
Right? It's like I couldn't fit like my profile picture into the entire machine, you know, and you were trying to learn, but you would boot it up and it would go right into Microsoft Basic. And, I think the thing that's hard to understand now where we're, you're 2 taps away from a 2 gigabyte app downloading is like, if you didn't create software on the device, there was no software on the device.
Yeah.
Right. And so out of necessity, you do the thing. And then that feeling, which I think still feels the same way when I get something to build, when I get something to compile of, I can type this in and it's going to light up and do the thing I said. And also I will have the bug that I made, I made the thing. And I still feel the way I felt as a kindergartner, right? Which is like, I can make something in the world, and I might not have, whatever. I'm not a great athlete. I can't sing, I can't do those things, but in this space, I can make something that didn't exist before. And then eventually, actually in short order, got a Commodore 64, got those other computers, and got online. And I think the thing people forget is before there was the web, there was this sort of proto-internet. And so being able to connect, again, as a kid, to local community online, downloading apps, trying, we call them programs then, connecting, like just finding ideas, being able to research things, share code, all those things, they're very, very primitive versions, but the behavior of when I was in grade school is not substantially different from the motivation I have when I'm making something today, or when I look at a project like I've been working on Glitch for years. I look at an app that pops up it's that same feeling. So I think that was really instilled at an early age, at the same time as I was discovering that I loved music, that I loved to, watch a great film, that I loved to read a great book. Like, this was a creative medium, and you could know the creators at that time.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the other things that sort of jumps out is you would have, this is a niche reference, but I think people will get it. The Atari video game consoles were popular at the time too. And they had, Activision was the first sort of independent publisher. And they put the names of the creators of the games onto the cartridges and into the manuals. And so my experience was, it was no different than an author of a book.
Yeah.
It was no different than the director of a film. And so I got a view that I think a lot of people who've come up, if you started, a kid that's been using, that's 10 years old, has been using the modern internet their whole lives, the idea that the tech on my phone, the apps on my laptop or whatever are made by a person who made choices is almost completely abstracted away.
Yeah.
But my introduction to it was I was connecting with these people who had made something in the way that I could make something. And theirs was fancier, but I could make something. And that still is like the animating thing that feels like one of the most empowering discoveries of my life.
It feels like an idea that's kind of gaining momentum, this idea of like video game authors as auteurs. It's definitely
come back into the popular, I think, imagination.
Yeah, I think like the complexity of designing and getting a video game out there is possibly not akin to even like a blockbuster movie, maybe like a Marvel movie, but
right.
Yeah, it's an interesting theory. And at what point did it go from like tinkering hobbyist to like, I could make a career out of this?
Fairly quickly. Again, being the child of immigrants, my folks had a side business they needed a billing system for. We'd gotten to the next Commodore, which was a Commodore 128.
Yeah.
And, it was basically duct tape and a mail merge and a very primitive office suite. I didn't have Microsoft Office yet. But I built a billing system for my dad, when I was probably in junior high school.
Yeah.
And
how do you learn to do it? Textbooks?
Yeah. This is such an interesting thing. Software had manuals.
Yeah.
So you could read a manual for a word processor and be like, here's how to mail merge data from your spreadsheet and bring it in. And then a lot of trial and error, for sure.
That's basic programming.
Exactly. I mean, that again, that hasn't changed that much. We have Stack Overflow now, but like it wasn't that distinct. And so, and also it wasn't that advanced either, right? Like so much value. This is the thing that's hard to remember now. At that time, like you're still maybe in the first decade of spreadsheets existing.
Yeah.
And so much of what you're unlocking is like the kind of like primitives of consumer computation are just like a word processor exists, a spreadsheet exists. Like we think of those as like the air we breathe.
Yeah.
But when they're new, so much value got unlocked by that if you just could steer these things slightly and, like I said, duct tape them together, you can make something. So that was it. And then by the time I was in high school, we had, there was I saw this ad in the paper, and it was somebody saying like, basically, we help us put together computers. Like you get the motherboards and the chips and do what I was thinking. I'm just doing this for, a hobby.
Yeah.
And I interviewed with a guy that eventually became my first business partner. But at that time, I was like 15 years old or something. And he's like, can you do this? And, we'll pay you this much. And I was like, look, I would do this for the same rate as flipping burgers.
Yes.
Right. This is way less hard and way more fun and way more interesting. And that led down the path where they're like, oh, you can code too. I was like, yeah, I mean, of course, you got to be able to do this stuff and started working on projects. And eventually that guy who hired me when I was 15 or 16, right the day after graduating high school, we started a business together and, making software for some sort of vertical applications and stuff. And that was how I sort of brought what I knew about machines and computers and tech into being an entrepreneur, really from a very young age.
Yeah. And we'll talk about like how you're adapting to life at a company the size of Fastly, but most of your career, I believe, it kind of stayed in that startup world.
Yeah. I mean, that was always my default, really just out of personality and temperament. I mean, I have a real appreciation for what they're, the $1 trillion companies. There's certain things only they can do.
Of course.
And I actually was very much a student of. At that era, it was Microsoft and Apple, right? And sort of 80s. And I would read every book and every magazine and every interview with any of them. And I still, to this day, like one of my greatest heroes and mentors in my career has been Dan Bricklin, who invented VisiCalc and the first spreadsheet.
Yeah.
And I told him the first time I met him, like, I have the articles I clipped of like, here's an interview. And he's like, shouldn't you have been like looking at like football players or, it's like, and I just was like, I mean, I also had like, I was reading about the, who was on MTV.
Yeah.
But it was the same thing to me. Like I revered those folks. And what's been extraordinary to me is like, and I'm a little older than probably a lot of folks that are listening, but like I have gotten to like be in like peer relationships with those people.
Yeah.
And so you talk to people who are like, before you did this work, the spreadsheet didn't exist, right? The app for which the phrase killer app was invented.
Yeah.
Right. And so to have that sort of spring forth from your head, you build the thing. And at that time, they're like, you have to like put it in a box and ship it to people, like all those things. Yeah. But there are folks who are still working and still building apps, and you can email them and they respond. And whether it's somebody that invented PowerPoint or like whatever you want to point to, I think that sense of accessibility and like that these were really humanized people, and that they were so casual then too, right? Because if you would read an interview with Bill Gates in like 1985. It's just some guy that had a company. You know what I mean? It wasn't like the cultural figure or whatever.
He was a kid.
Yeah. And so as a kid, you're just like, I could do that.
Yeah.
Like it doesn't seem like this, like you're not trying to be the richest person in the history of the world or to, cure malaria. You're just like, I want to make something. And there are people like me who are older, but they made something. And at that time also, so much of the story was, they're so young.
Yeah.
Right. Like Bill Gates drops out of college. Like that's the first time somebody has that story of like, you could be a teenager and make something cool.
It's really touching on something, because I was reading Ed Zitron the other day. And he was talking about kind of he wrote a big blog post about generative AI and just like kind of all the kind of nasty impacts it's going to have on the industry.
Yeah.
But what he wasn't talking directly about, but what it got me thinking about was this idea. And, we put on conferences, Lead Dev put on conferences. And so we're always looking for great speakers. And I feel like 20 years ago, you could go and find the guy that created the app that you use and get them to come on stage. And I find that we're less and less able to do that, to find that person that is linked to that thing.
Because it's not how it's made anymore. I think very much about, I was part of a cohort of folks that very early on adopted South by Southwest as one of our big community events, right? And I had known that conference because I had been in the music business, and that was originally you take your band there and you hope to play a showcase and get discovered and get a record deal and all those kinds of things. But the internet people, I mean, they literally called it South by Southwest Multimedia the first year I went. Later they called it Interactive. And the first years that we went, we were practitioners. So we were like, should a website have comments? And if so, how should they work?
Yeah.
And how might we anticipate the problems that were coming? Like those are the kinds of discussions. Or literally, CSS might be a thing. What would we do if it is? Right? And so like there's these topics that were like that sound like such basic conversations, but they were about the practice. They were about the craft of building a site, an app, a tool, a community, whatever it was. And so they were closer to, if it had been on the music side, about learning to play guitar or drums, rather than I already have a band, how do I get signed?
Yes.
And then what changed?
Jump to step.
What changed after Twitter took off, or Foursquare was like a big hit back then, was now you were taking your app there to be discovered and to be promoted. And
it's like the Y Combinator effect, right?
Yeah, and it was definitely the acceleration of the VC-based mindset of like Y Combinator and all those things, but also I think it was a difference in why you were doing it, right? Because one of the things that was great was like, so at that era, I helped build some of the early blogging tools, like they were called Movable Type and LiveJournal, and those were very popular, kind of like the WordPress of their day, right? And then there were people building other similar tools. So Matt Mullenweg was building WordPress, and there was like Ev Williams and his team building Blogger. But we all knew each other, right? So the idea is we were doing a thing, and you might be like, well, I have this feature and you have that, that's a competitive thing. But the sense was we were in community, and there was a set of norms around what do you collaborate on, including, and this is an old-fashioned idea, but like open standards, open protocols. There should be the ability to own your data and transfer it, to control your environment, do those things. But also, you simply wouldn't transgress against the community in certain ways. Right? If somebody had been like systematically surveilling their users and misusing their data, you would be mortified to go to a party with them. Yes. Right? Because you would be like, that's a horrible thing that you did. Why would you do that to people? Right? And so it acted as a really great, gating factor. There are a lot of challenges with that. That is, the thing I just described that is a good social control is also, if you squint at it, an old boys network of very privileged people. Like, I'm not unaware, like it's a double-edged thing. But the power of community is that you can call people in and say, that's not the done thing. Yeah. That's simply not how we act. And you can feel the social weight of ostracism, right? And I think so much of the shift, in addition to everything is just about a performance to promote your thing. Yeah. You don't want to be out there as a creator, that they don't have any say. You're not in collaboration or community with people. But also so much of the radicalization of especially the sort of VC cohort is that they have no ability to take that criticism. They're not a community of people. And so they react fairly violently.
Incredibly sensitive.
Right? Yeah. When at mild criticism. Yeah. Because I used to be a fairly mild critic because I would be in the room with the folks and I would be like, oh, probably shouldn't do that. And they would act like I slapped them in the face. Yeah. And I'm a much more pointed critic because I've been around longer and seen the harms in those things. But I think they still, like, the defining trait is their inability to be in community with people in a way that people are going to give you feedback. And the funny thing about that is, like, that's bug reports. That's basic. Yeah. That's a pull request. That's the, even the, like, prior to GitHub, the mailing list where you say, here's a bug that I found. Yeah. And can you be a person who says a bug report is a gift? And I think that's a thing that an engineering culture understands innately, like a resilient, anti-fragile infrastructure that you want to build that's going to sustain over time, or an experience that you want to build that's going to be meaningful over time. You have to see a bug report as a gift you're grateful for. Yeah. Even, maybe they could be nicer about it, but like that's the piece. And I think that's the biggest change is that so people disappear. So I'm not surprised you have challenge finding the person that made the app, because there's sort of two parts to that. One is, I don't want to be accountable. Yeah. I don't want to be a person who can be called in, called out for the mistakes that I make in this. And it can be hard. I mean, I've faced lots of mostly valid criticism about, app choices. I wish you hadn't done this and that, right? Like it's very rarely the more fundamental structural things. But I think it's also there's an element of vulnerability to it. And can you choose to be confident enough and trusting enough to be vulnerable in front of maybe millions of people? Yeah. If that's how many people are using your app or your platform, if you're lucky enough to have that kind of base. And like, I feel that every day. Like, I have a platform that millions of people use, and how do I be accountable to them in the best possible way? The ideal is they should never have to think about me. Yeah. Right. Like it should never be an issue. But if they do, they should be like, well, they're trying their best. Yeah. That's as good as it gets. And can you feel that way?
Yeah. And it feels like in your career, you kind of gravitated towards a few kind of domains, typically in like the music or the media business. Did you like do that on purpose? Was that because that's an area that you were kind of passionate about and you thought, oh, if I'm going to do this technical job, I might as well do it in an area that I find interesting?
Yeah. I don't know how else to be, I think I would have never fit in it's a relatively new thing where I talk to like people I'll be mentoring early career, and they'll say something like, I just want to work at a FANG company. Okay, yeah. Right? And I'm like, I don't, like, it is a category error. Yes. Right? Like what Netflix does in the world has nothing to do with what Facebook does in the world, right? Or Meta or whatever. And so you're like, what is your category there? And like, well, they're tech companies. I was like, well, what company's not a tech company? Right? And, they employ coders. That's not having anything in common. No. Right? And so that's so intellectually confusing to me because of the way I look at it, which is like, what are the things that I am moved by, motivated by, almost to the point of irrationality? Yeah. Like, why do I get up in the morning? Because there's things I love. I love community. I love to, collaborate with people. I like when people share ideas. I love music and the arts. I love, there's things. And so, I worked at a newspaper, but in the newspaper I was the tech guy helping me get the stories out. Yeah. And I worked in the music industry, but there I was helping me get the music out. Like it's sort of this, like, I love to be in a place of find creative people who have a unique idea in the world, support their creativity by giving them the technology tools that they might not have because they're trying to be a musician, not a technologist. They're trying to be a writer and not a technologist. And that's sort of the superpower. Like this is and it's very parallel to what we were talking about. Like, I'm a New Yorker. I live on the Lower East Side. There's a really, really, part of the reason I love it so much, there's a decades and centuries long tradition of community support
Yeah.
for the creative arts. So, there are fundamental milestone moments in the birth of hip hop, the birth of contemporary jazz, the birth of punk music that all happened.
I'm a big indie guy, so the Strokes and
exactly, and it's all within like blocks of where I'm raising my child because there's this long history, and also, I live in a cooperative housing complex that like garment workers unions in the 40s built.
Yeah.
So there's just this in the DNA of the community. We have a community garden. And anybody can plant whatever they want and take whatever they want, and it works. And it's the thing that everybody would say would never function in a city like New York, and it really does. And so I think that's like the cultural context into which I look at like technology can be in dialogue with the arts and with community organizing and civic planning and safe streets and like all these other movements that might not be immediately obvious, but like why do so many coders we know are like really, evangelical about bike riding, or about baking bread, or about their, their garden, or about, and like, why do we have these synchronicities of like the Ruby coder to woodworker pipeline, right? And it's because the creative arts are the closest to the ethos we have of why we create with tech. And then there are people who are like, I looked at a spreadsheet, I found where the largest opportunity was. It said that technology was the way to do it. It was a coin toss as to whether I would do that or go into finance.
Terrifying.
I picked one, and that was the one I picked. And like, I struggle with it. Like, I don't morally judge that. Like, if somebody's saying I want to provide opportunity in my family, of course that makes sense. But it is so foreign to, I did this when I was broke. I did this when nobody liked it. I did this when it was painfully uncool. Mm-hmm. I did this when it was hard.
Yeah.
And
but it was more like I'm good at something. And I'm interested in this area, so I'm going to bring it there.
And also I liked the people who were doing it for similar reasons. I found to be incredibly meaningful and challenging collaborators who were intellectually honest and who would hold me accountable.
Yeah.
And who, when I did make a mistake, did call me out, but in a way where they wanted me to fix it.
Yeah.
And I think that kind of thing, it's been erased from the narrative of what tech is.
Yeah.
And it's hard to find a job in that, to be clear. Like, I think everybody's like, you got to do the thing that pays the bills. So like, I don't judge anybody if you're like, you're at a big company, you're like, this is what I got to do because I get to practice my craft doing this thing. And then on the weekends, I built my own project. Like, I think that's a very fair trade-off. Like, every great musician started with a day job, every great artist, had that thing. So I don't have a criticism of that, but I think that's the thing is like, as much as possible, I've been trying to craft a career and make space for others now to build careers where they get to do work they're proud of in the long term. Mm-hmm. And I look back and I don't have, as is going to be the case, and this is the thing I'll say, like, I'm not, I'm in my 40s, so like I'm older than a lot of people in tech, but I'm not like 80.
Yeah.
And already most of the lines of code I've ever written have been erased, right? Have been replaced.
Yeah.
Most of the designs I've done for apps have been thrown away. Every, product requirements document I've ever created is in the trash in Google Docs, right?
Yeah.
So like it's all ephemeral.
Yeah.
But I was at, we were talking earlier, I was at the XOXO festival in Portland, which is like a celebration of indie culture. And I had people come up to me I'd never met, say like, oh, you worked on this app like 20 years ago and it helped me start my blog. And then I made this friend and that got me to a job and it opened a door. And, it's so meaningful, but also here's an interesting thing. I didn't do anything with that.
No.
Right? Like that's a thing that they did, but they felt like the technology empowered them.
Yeah.
And they wanted to have that dialogue, but they wouldn't have that conversation about something that makes their pencil.
No.
Right? It's because of that unique thing that tech does of feeling like I can do something I couldn't do before.
Yeah, it's not a tech thing, but I listened to this incredible podcast a couple of years ago with a writer and podcaster that I really love called Chris Ryan, who works for The Ringer, used to work for Grant, and he was on the long form podcast, and he started out as a blogger. Yeah. And he basically, like you, had a huge amount of interest in two things, basketball and music. And he would just blog about basketball and music. And he was talking about how like he wasn't doing it for anyone but himself. But what it did was he discovered that it was a craft and he just got better and better and better at it. He didn't care about monetizing. He didn't care about how big the audience was. He wasn't doing it to get a job. He got all those things eventually, but he was doing it because he loved it. And I think that we're kind of dancing around the fact that might be going away a little bit.
It comes and goes.
Yeah.
This is the thing I say is I've been through a few cycles of this, and I was talking earlier to John Gruber, who does the Daring Fireball blog about Apple culture, and he's been doing it 20 years plus now. And again, he's one of those people. I'd helped him set up his blog in the early days to get made the tool. I was the arms dealer for somebody doing that kind of work, right? And that's 20 years ago. But also, like 2 weeks ago, talking to Molly White, who does Web3, is going great.
Yeah,
right. Molly. And she's incredible. And the thing and they're very, very different. They couldn't be more different personalities or people or whatever. But the thing that ties them together in temperament is every day they show up and they talk about the thing that they're a world expert on. Yeah. And they go with passion and honesty, and people can see over time, they really believe this. And I might not always agree, but I always think like this person believes this with conviction. And in so doing, they sort of shift the entire conversation about the biggest company in the history of the world, or the biggest, sort of financial bubble that's been blown up in recent years, whatever you want to point to. And they're just a person at a keyboard. Yeah. That is the incredible leverage that, like, if you have a little bit of technical knowledge and a lot of passion, the dedication to do it, you can do. And I just I can't stop being inspired by that. And I get to meet people like that through the work I do over the last 20 years, is 25 years almost now. It's just like giving people those tools over and over. And then the window in which you're doing your best version of that work and the world is willing to see it, they don't overlap right away. You know what I mean? Like you find the time when it starts to resonate. And I think of, like, using the analogy we started talking about, like, I was a Prince fan. I started my blog 25 years ago, around the turn of the century. It sounds it's literally just called Anil Dash, right? Yeah. And at that time, people were like, "That's so arrogant. You named it after yourself, right?" And
everyone does that.
And it's like these things go in and out of fashion. But I started the blog, and I just said it was a blog about, like, making culture. But I would write about, Prince a little bit sometimes. At that time, he had, like, changed his name to a symbol, was considered pretty much a has-been, a little bit embarrassing. So I was, like, very trepidatious, because you're like, why do you care about this, like, kind of has-been 80s pop star or whatever, right? And then by the time he passed, like about 80 years ago or something, he'd become the, like, kind of a, elder statesman of rock and roll. And people were like, oh, it's like a fun, interesting pop culture person, like what Dolly Parton is. Everybody's like, there's some cool stories, and everything I find out that person's kind of interesting. Even if you're like, if you don't listen to Dolly Parton's music all the time, you probably still think she's really interesting culturally and like that kind of thing. And then to be the person writing about the thing, well, they went back and they're like, oh, it turns out there was 20 years of thinking about this thing, about this problem. And so, like, it's points on the board, like to the basketball analogy. It's like, just keep getting, like, take as many shots as you can. Yeah. Just keep getting points on the board. As you do it, sometimes you don't even know why you are. You reveal to yourself why you are. And I think about friends that, like, they take time off from their day job working in tech to go learn a new programming language. Yeah. Right? Yeah. And in any other discipline, that would sound like madness. No. Right? And I think for our cohort, for the people that sort of connect around that idea, it's like, I'm either honing my craft, or I'm discovering a new version of me. Yeah. I'm literally learning to speak a new language, and we think of the world through the lens of the languages we know. Yeah. Growing up bilingual, that was really obvious to me. And so I think there's a lot of those parts that are just, I still am so animated and excited by. I get to watch with, like, Glitch, for example, every day people build apps, and I get to see them, and I'm like, I never would have thought of that. I never would have thought of building it that way. Or it's really simple and it's their first attempt, but what a new world they've walked into. Yeah. And those things are, like, every bit as exciting as they were the first day I saw them.
It feels like a bunch of these kind of, like, themes of your career kind of all came to a bit of a head when you met Joel Spolsky of Trello and Stack Overflow fame and various other things. But I think that kind of hitching your wagon to someone who is a creator, who's so passionate about this stuff, that clearly felt like a good marriage. You ended up as the CEO of that company that ended up becoming Glitch. Yeah. But tell me more about, like, how you met Joel and like how immediate did that kind of connection become apparent?
It's funny. The literal first time we met was, and this is sort of a dated story, but I think it's charmingly so. Every blogger in New York City got together, and we fit around 2 tables at a restaurant. Yeah. And this is in 1999. And Joel was there, and I was already reading his blog. And I was, it was funny because I was like, oh, that's that Microsoft guy. He had worked on Microsoft Excel. That was kind of his his brand at the time was he'd been a product manager on Excel. And he and Michael Pryor had started a company called Fog Creek Software. They were a software consultancy. This has sort of been lost in the mists of time, but they were a software consultancy. And they had a townhouse, actually not far from where we were recording this. And I went to see them, and 2 or 3 of them in the office, and they were just doing, coding projects for clients. And I was like, this guy has an interesting point of view. I took a lot away of like, there's an interesting rhetorical style where he would sort of go on, he had a blog, Joel on Software, which was, I think, honestly, the first big tech culture gathering spot. Like it felt like a must read in a way. And actually, I think it's somewhat similar in being a predecessor to the like Hacker News kind of vibe, where it's like everybody read it. You felt like you had to know it was there. And fully 50, maybe 90% of the people were disagreeing with, or they're there to argue with something. Yeah. And I think he sort of had that, rhetorical stance of let me say something provocative and get you to respond kind of thing, which, that's the blogs are still like that, right? Yeah. But that was sort of the beginning of that era. But going and meeting Joel and Michael in person, they were so thoughtful and Michael couldn't be more opposite, like the most soft-spoken, very introverted kind of contemplative kind of person, but they were like a very yin and yang. And in short order, they built a bunch of different apps and tools. They built a bug tracking tool, which was sort of like it was a direct influence on what became Jira. Yeah. So like they sort of built a lot of those tools. And
I discovered today that they built something called Copilot.
Yes. So this is actually, and that's actually a really interesting sort of tangent story. They would do almost every year, a cohort of interns come in, have an idea, build an app, give them a lot of space. It was almost like a little bit of an incubation model. And a lot of those apps, if they didn't become a big success, they would let the creators take them off on their own. So Copilot was one of those, which was like a remote desktop control tool. It's like for doing tech support and those kinds of things. I said probably today, the most valuable thing about it would have been the copilot.com domain.
100%.
But it was, like many things, it was very prescient. Like it was very much forecasting the future, but also a little, like as was of their sort of cohort, like very Windows focused, very wonky, kind of thing. But the tool was great. It actually was still a going concern until a couple of years ago. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the alumni of that sort of Joel Spolsky cinematic universe are all still in touch. And so fast forward a bit, they were, I think 2007 or so, talking about like Joel had this huge audience of developers. Basically, the majority of devs in the world were kind of reading the stuff that he was out there sharing. And he'd built these other tools, the bug tracking tools that were popular, but they were still software, in a way. And it was really obvious that the social web was coming and should be there for developers. GitHub didn't exist yet. Yeah. And I was in 2007, I was at the first ever event at Microsoft where they embraced open source. This was like a radical, they had been, very antagonistic to Linux and all those kinds of things. And I was in a hallway with Jeff Atwood, who had begun working with Joel. The two of them were the co-creators of Stack Overflow. And we were brainstorming names for this developer site, the Q&A site. And I remember like a tablet of paper that I think was from the event, and Jeff and I writing names, and my thing was like, it's got to be like a shibboleth that like only coders will know. Yeah. And I was like, what do we all know? It's like bugs and errors. It was really it. And so it was a list of all these bugs. And Stack Overflow is one that jumped out. I don't even know if that was the favorite I had of them, but it was like the one that was like, if you know what this is, you know what it is, and you're sort of in the community. And and Joel and Jeff built a really incredible team. They built the community. But what was wild about it was, it was a few weeks in, there were 1 million developers on the site. Like it was instant. There was that much latent need. And the thing that stands out to me now, the short version of the rest of that story is like I joined the board when they became their own independent company. Yeah. I was on the board for its independent run. I represented the community on the board, which, everybody else is like venture capitalists, and you have, the first person from Andreessen Horowitz and from, all those things there. But I was meant to represent the community. And, there's, I think the strengths and the weaknesses of it, you can go into in depth. But I think one of the things that jumps out to me is, all other things aside, one thing is what coders do is enormously valuable in the world. There is arguably no more highly compensated and powerful cohort of workers has ever existed than coders and programmers and engineers, right?
Yeah, agree.
And no other cohort has ever collectively said, we are going to completely democratize access to the knowledge of doing what we do. Yeah. And you're going to be able to see it, view source on it, and share it. And GitHub came along in short order thereafter, but I think you think of these as two halves of the whole, right, between GitHub and Stack Overflow. And there were also many predecessors. Like I think of like the comments on the PHP.net website, were my Stack Overflow when I was learning. But so there's lots of other examples. But if you think of like those as the apotheosis of a certain era of these tools, and but they both was enormous acts of community generosity and an ethos that was we share how to do what we do so others can do it too, because there's a joy in it and a creativity in it. And I think of this particularly, like I was born in the States, but like, being of Indian descent, South Asian descent, one of the greatest drivers of equity, access, social mobility, economic mobility for the entire subcontinent has been access to the same information, resources, technologies as the wealthiest people in the world have. Mm-hmm. And it's still profound and meaningful to me. And it didn't have to go that way. It could easily have been paywalled. It could easily have been, you had to know somebody. It could easily have been an old boys network, and there were, to be clear, very clear structural problems in Stack Overflow. Like everybody knows the like getting smacked down by a jerk and the answers, and I think those are things where they did make substantive efforts to try to improve it, but it's a hard problem once the culture is set. But at the same time,
moderation is a hell of a problem.
And I have dealt with this at scale many times. The thing that jumps out to me is there is no widespread misinformation on the platform. Mm-hmm. There were never roving bands of Nazis. Yeah. There's no hate movements. There's no, and like, that's a low bar, but that is where the bar was.
Yeah.
Right? Because they came up at the same time as Reddit was being created and 4chan was taking off. Like, it could have gone another way. And so, like, for all the weaknesses and complaints, it succeeded in one of the great democratizations of information access for personal and professional development that's ever existed. So it's pretty shocking. Like, it's striking that it could happen, and it's amazing that it did. And it leaves me with a lot of misgivings about how others are exploiting that base of knowledge now too.
Yeah. And then how about Glitch? Like, where did Glitch?
So the sort of the bookend of that story is like Stack Overflow was taking off. Joel was busy running that. The same company, Fog Creek, kept doing the incubation, came up with Trello, and then Michael Pryor, the other partner, starts running that, and that becomes a
massive,
millions of users, multi-$100 million business. And so they were like, we're busy running these things, and they made another thing, right? And I saw this prototype at that time. It was called HyperDev, as a tribute to HyperCard back in the 90s on the Apple computers. I saw this prototype of what became Glitch, and the technological thing I would say is, we were just at the cusp of maturity for Docker and for some of the rich manipulation in browsers on front end and a couple other technologies. So there was orchestration was a mess. There was a lot of things that were not.
You got Heroku starting to abstract,
and Heroku had also been acquired and started to stagnate too. So you had the business driver as well as the piece. I mean, I have all the respect in the world for Heroku. I mean, I think if you look at whether it's Glitch or we get compared to Replit a lot or like any of these tools, everything that any of us were trying to do, Heroku was trying to do a decade earlier.
Yeah.
But they were trying to do it on like old version of Internet Explorer. And, they originally even had a code editor in Heroku at one point, and they had to, take it down. So I
wrote a big piece a few years ago about what happened at Heroku. And like whenever I spoke to people for that piece, everyone's response was always, I loved Heroku, and now I'm just trying to build it again.
Yeah, and so that wasn't the explicit goal for us, but that was definitely an influence. Yeah. For me, a lot of it was, we looked a lot at, again, I'm dating myself, but it was such a seminal work, Visual Basic in the 90s as a democratizer. I looked at HyperCard. We looked a lot at, so for folks who don't know, so Glitch is a community where you can build an app in your browser, a full stack app.
Yeah.
In basically under a minute.
Yeah.
And you don't even have to log in. You just go and you pick an app that's already there and you remix it.
Yeah.
And then you've got a full stack running app and you can edit and tweak. And most of those primitives I just talked about were in the original prototype, right? And so like the idea that we were going to spin up a container in real time in the background while you clicked on it, like that was a really radical thing. But in that first review I saw of the prototype, I was like, oh, well, you got to let people take the existing app and remix it. And that was in my notes, like the word remix. And I was like, and then that was music became the animating metaphor for Glitch. Like we talk about playlists of apps and we talk about remixing apps, but that was there. And then we have the interface for Git. If you want to go back through old commits, it's called Rewind. So you have a timeline, you can slide back and scrub through it. But that was all there in literally that first page of notes. If I look at that, and that was 2016, so 8 years ago. And I think we've gotten to about a third of the things I put in the notes on that page. And like we were off and running pretty quickly. And so I looked at the thing, I was like, this is incredible. I can see this whole community you build around it. Like the social object is the app, not the code. Like GitHub is the code, and that's great for its thing. But that's like that's a recipe book. I want a restaurant.
Yeah.
Right.
Like the people that actually just want to do the thing.
Yeah. And so we just thought a lot about like, what would YouTube for code look like? That was one of the things we talked about. And so I was excited. I was really super motivated, but I'd just come out of a startup that was winding down. I was very like pretty done with tech, honestly. I was like, I think take some time or whatever. And, Joel was like, why don't you come take a look at this thing? I was like, it's great. Good luck. I hope it does great. I'm not interested.
Yeah.
And, it was another 4 or 6 months. And I couldn't get the idea out of my head.
Yeah, it's such a good fit for you though. That's the problem, is it's got that community element to it that's gonna like lodge itself in your brain.
And I felt like we had a little bit of original sin to atone from the work on Stack Overflow. Frankly, I think that like the first word on the Glitch homepage on launch day was like the friendly community where you'll build the app of your dreams. And friendly was really intentional about sort of undoing some of that challenge that Stack Overflow had faced, which I think was very successful. I mean, I think you talk to users, and I think they independently would be like, we love the vibes, we love the colors, and they'll say friendly unprompted. Yeah. Like we don't have to put that up, on the top of the page anymore. And it's been so meaningful because it was a leap. Like everybody was like, you need to have green text on a black background. You need to have an editor that you show when you do the thing. And then we relaunched it as Glitch. They hated the name. People are like, you can't name, a app or a community after a bug or a problem. And I was like, Stack Overflow is like, I was like, there's some proof here actually. Yeah. And I loved that there was a little bit of a sibling relationship of like, where the problems, this is where the problems live, and that this is an environment where you can make mistakes. But when we launched, we literally shared an office with Trello. Yeah. Like it was all that sort of communal. And I think, again, the accountability and the inspiration and the innovation is this being in dialogue with others. Like you squint and Glitch is a remix of Trello and Stack Overflow. Yeah. Right. And so I think that part was it. But also for me, really importantly at that time, New York City has a tech community. Yeah. And we have what was called the New York Tech Meetup originally. You can tell it started when Meetup started, which was one of our signature startups. And people would get together, by the hundreds. But like we were selling 1,000 tickets a month at $20 a pop, selling out in 10 minutes for people to come and just see pure demos. You weren't allowed to pitch. You weren't allowed. There was nothing. There's no VCs on stage. Nothing. It was just, I'm a maker. To your point, I'm a maker. I made a thing. I want to show you. The majority. We would have students demoing. The majority would be not. So that's the context in which, in short order, you had Stack Overflow, you had Trello, you had Tumblr, you had Foursquare, you had Etsy, you had Kickstarter, you had Meetup, you had this whole cohort. And it was no surprise around that time that when in the States we had our SOPA and people laws coming up, when they needed leaders in tech to come to Washington, D.C. and say, don't put this bad law in place, it was all people from New York. They all got on a train and went down there. And Aaron Swartz sort of leading this rally in front of our senator's office. That came from having a community conscience of people saying we're accountable to each other, even though all of those at that point were multi-$100 million companies. And so I think that has been lost. We don't have that now, but we know we have the seeds to do that kind of thing, so it can happen again.
I really noticed this kind of like green shoots of it recently in the front end world. And I find that like obviously Fastly, which is where you work now, and Netlify as well, like I've seen this kind of beginnings of like being proud of being a front end developer and being part of the community. And there's kind of an image, and there's kind of even like some cliches now, but cliches are a good sign. It's a sign of a community happening. I'm definitely starting to see that happen in that world, and I feel like I
think it's really real.
Acquisition of Glitch probably is a like front runner of what's happening there.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, I think at the time 2+ years ago when Glitch was acquired, it was not as obvious. Yeah. But I think, as you mentioned, Netlify, Vercel, I think they've all done an incredible job of being part of that broader narrative. I've been a front end dev for most of my career,
Yeah.
right? When I was a working coder, and even still when I do weekend projects, like that's the part I love. And it's a way of thinking, right? And for me, it's like I said, I loved seeing it light up on that Commodore computer. And the same is true as like, they hit refresh in the browser and it did the thing I wanted it to do. I think that's the closest to the user. It's the closest to the magic that a new coder can see. And it doesn't have to be like full, I'm not all the caveats about React aside, right?
Yeah.
Like this, but like being able to see the thing, it means a lot. And so I think that entry point to like starting closest to the visible act of creation, and then you need to have infrastructure. And so your point, so Fastly acquired Glitch, 2 years ago, and they were almost as pure a back-end infrastructure company as you could be. But part of what I glimpsed at was they have built this like instant platform. You can do anything instantly around the world, like 150 milliseconds, right? And I was like, oh, well, yeah, content delivery. They're like, no, code or like interaction. Like, and all of a sudden I was like, this is almost like having another primitive to work with. Like it is at the same level. It's like taking an instant network and putting it at the same level as storage and compute and these other things.
It's
and
where the
so
industry is going. You got Cloudflare workers. Like it's the direction of travel.
And that just seemed like so compelling. And then it's like, well, then the thing that you need to have is glitch level ease. Like it has to be that easy to just click a button and build something for a minute. But also I really thought there's just something interesting about introducing a new primitive to the toolkit that we all think of. Because for me personally, like if I never hear a US East one again, like it'll be too soon. Like thinking about regions breaks my brain, because my concept of the internet was it's just everywhere.
Of course.
So like when I made code, like the first time I remember, like, well, what do you mean the server's in New Jersey? Right? like what shouldn't it be on the internet? Right? Like, and they're like, yeah, well, there's a place that it goes. And so it fits so much better my, admittedly naive mental conception of like, I just make this code or I make this content and it's just everywhere and I don't have to think about it. And I think that like taking away certain levels of abstractions are really joyous. Yeah. And that was definitely one of them. And so that was sort of the entry point. There's a lot more stuff that came from that, but I think that was like a really, I don't know, just it was as exciting as when you discover these other capabilities.
Yeah. And now we're 2 years into that acquisition. You're still at Fastly. You've got a very grown-up job title there.
I do.
So how has that transition been for you in terms of kind of going from the startup world to being part of a bigger organization like Fastly?
It's been a lot of learning. I think I had consulted and stuff over the years. I'd worked with big companies, but being inside is different. There's no question about it. I mean, I think, on the one hand, when I was a CEO, I could be like, let's do this, and we sort of go and do it. I think on the other hand, it was a really good challenge to have to put intellectual rigor behind the why of why I said to do something. Yeah. In many cases, maybe I'm not right on this, because you have to make the case to people who are like, I don't know who you are. Yeah. There's 1,000 people at this company. You could be anybody, and I don't, it's nice. I'm sure you're nice, but like, what are we doing and why? And that was a really good counter. Like as we record this, there's a lot of hype in the VC world about like founder mode. People are talking about this a lot. And there's sort of, I've been on both sides of it, right? And there is a founder mode that is like, if you're lucky, you get a leader who is a visionary and is clear and motivating and inspiring, and they're empathetic towards users and their team. And so they can galvanize people to move quickly, meaningfully towards something. And a founder can be a jerk who's just abusing their power and on an ego trip and doesn't want accountability to anybody and hates processes of accountability, calling them red tape and overhead.
Of course.
Right. And I
won't call anyone out, but their initials might be EM.
And my feeling is most of the people promoting the myth of founder mode are trying to get into as unaccountable a situation as Musk or anybody else is in, right?
Yeah.
And for me, like I've been a founder, and I've said this before. I've been a CEO, I've been a founder. It's a horrible job. I hate it. Mm. I do it because I have done it because it's the only way to get done the things I wanted to see get done. But every error I made, every mistake I made in those roles hurt either our community or our team or both.
Yeah.
And I think of this. It actually feels a little bit like being a parent. I don't want to overextend that analogy, but in one way, in that I can only screw this up for others.
Yeah.
Right. Like for me, I don't bear the worst pain of a mistake that I make.
Yeah.
Right. And I've said this, you know, the like the difference between being at a big company and like try to do my best. If I make a mistake, you know, I think somebody like, you should not do that, or we should fix that, or whatever. And I'm lucky to have good support from, you know, my boss or my peers or whatever. Right. But I could make a mistake when we were a startup and everybody would lose their jobs. Right. That being the last thing I thought of every night when I went to sleep and the first thing I thought of when I got up, especially in the US where it literally means whether people can have health care, whether they can have children, whether they can take care of their family members. First of all, it's immoral that I had that power. You know, like it's just fundamentally wrong. It's obviously wrong.
Yeah.
Right. It should not be up to me as to whether somebody who happens to be like a good Go coder can have, you know, healthcare when they get cancer. Like that's insane.
Yeah.
Right?
I think there's a lot of CEOs that just don't think about that stuff.
Well, I think they pay people so they think they don't have to think about it.
Yeah.
And this is why it's selected for more and more psychopathic behavior. I mean, I'm just being really honest about it.
Yeah.
It's like I look at like how did they get so extreme, and it's because they get more and more isolated from that cause. But I felt that honestly, like every day. So I don't feel that anymore. Like I get to go to work and think about what can we do for our developers, or what would be a cool feature to build. Or we just did actually a really good example. We did a thing called AI Accelerator, and it's basically you put a gateway in front of ChatGPT and we make your requests faster. You're like, yeah, no kidding. You take faster, you cache something, you make it faster. Like that's the thing we're known for. We just did a very smart semantic caching version of that. But the thing about that was my approach was like, I had enough authority to say, I'm not doing like the 15th LLM that gets pitched to my inbox. I was like, my whole inbox is people like, we got one too. I'm like, I don't care.
Yeah.
Right. But you talk to real developers and they're like, look, there are interesting things to do with OpenAI. Yeah. And the bad part is my users are watching a spinner all day. Right? You know, I would like that to be faster. I'm like, that is like an interesting problem. Yeah. That is something you can solve. I can have the authority to say, we're not going to just chase trends. We're going to do the thing that is meaningful to people. Yeah. And I couldn't do that as a startup. It wouldn't be credible, right? Because you're like, I'm not going to use some startup's brand new thing and have that be like, they might be gone in 5 minutes.
Of course. Right.
And so like that thing was like really, really rewarding in terms of all the pieces coming together. Like we have the technology to do something unique that nobody else can do. That's always exciting, right? So you're like, why did you invest in building this infrastructure so you can do something like semantic caching? So that's like technologically interesting. Yeah. Then you have the like social piece of all the smartest coders I know are like, LLMs are interesting because they've been interesting for a long time. AI hype is not at all interesting. Yeah. You know, like that's kind of where the smart folks have landed. How do you tell a story where people can understand how we're navigating that? That's an interesting problem space to me. Yeah. Because communicating with developers is really hard. Like the cliche is devs don't like marketing. Yeah. And it's like, that's not true. Yeah. They just want you to not treat them like idiots or spam them or, you know, whatever.
Bullshit. Then they
right, exactly. And so you're like, but that's like an interesting intellectual challenge. And then to get to lead a team, you're like, if we do this, we can put it in front of millions of people. Yeah. And everybody can use it. Like that stuff, so like those are the joys of being at scale or being, at a different platform.
So this is the Priority Zero podcast. So like in your role right now, as VP of Developer Experience, like what's your Priority Zero? What's that thing?
There's 3 parts to it, which are
that's cheating. But
yeah. Well, it's I mean, the P0 is get every developer in the world to find value in this platform. Yeah. Right. But the pillars of that are they have to know we exist, they have to know what we do, and they have to be able to try it for themselves and see that it's real. And what's shocking is like those 3 things are really hard for big organizations. But those are all in service of every dev in the world can find value in this platform that will make their job easier. Or to me, that's a nice thing, like, okay, performance, whatever. For me, it's like, I could do a thing I couldn't do before. Yeah. Is like exciting. And for me, I'm like, I'm not, like I said, I've been a front end person. I'm not like deeper in the stack. The idea of I could push the message to 1 billion people and each one would be personalized. I'm like, I could never in a million years build that. Yeah. Right. And it's like, it's just not, that's not the domain I play in. Something. And then to be like, here's an API and you can do that. Yeah, it's cool. That's exciting. So those are the parts that are really motivating. But yeah, the P0 is like, People on the internet deserve a better experience. Most devs want to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Can we give them the tools to do the good thing?
Yeah. It's a very big priority zero. I know I always ask people, like, how do you know when it's done? Like, how does that become not your priority zero?
Yeah.
But the problem is that's basically the mission, right?
Yeah. I mean, but that's also part of why I think I've been more of a startup person and why I try to bring that startup mentality, I think, to some degree to this is I'm motivated by missions.
Yeah.
Like I don't like features or whatever.
Yeah.
Features come and go. Like I said, my code's all going to get deleted someday.
Yeah. What
will be the impact of the work I have done? What will be the impact of what I've been able to enable my team to do? Those are the measures for real.
Nice. All right. And we always like to end the show on a recommendation. So is there anything you've listened to, watched, read recently that you want to recommend?
Gosh, I wasn't ready for that. I got to think of.
I prefer it when people aren't ready for it.
I'm going to give one that's probably unexpected. There's David Ritz, who is mostly a biographer, although he's co-written some pop songs. Wrote a biography of Aretha Franklin.
Mm.
And he had originally done an authorized one while she was alive. And then after she was passed, he did the real one. And it is, warts and all, she was a very complicated person. But it's stunning because you have this document of an individual artist who is also a social activist. She sang at Martin Luther King's funeral.
Yeah.
She is also an entrepreneur. She owned her own record labels in the 1970s. And just this sort of fearless pioneer and also a really flawed person. Mm-hmm. If everybody that ever made fan fiction up in their heads about Musk or Jobs or whoever read about Aretha Franklin instead, I think people would have a much better, purer understanding of what is entrepreneurship, what is innovation, what is creativity, what is greatness.
Yeah.
Dave Ritz's biography of Aretha.
That's an awesome recommendation. I love that.
Great.
Right, Anil, thank you so much for coming on. It was great.
Thanks for having me.
And I'll see you again soon.
Take care.
Thank you again for listening to Priority Zero, a Lead Dev podcast. Remember, you can get us wherever you get your podcasts, Apple, Spotify. But when you do, please remember to like and subscribe so you don't miss an episode. And we hope to see you at the next one.